Angry MGTOW here, or something like that. Today we're talking about how women will attack each other after feminism dies. This is a response to Turd Flinging Monkey. My sidekick recently made a video discussing the price of ending gynocentrism. So we're just gonna go ahead and do a little response. We're gonna be looking at his video and dissecting the video, not the monkey. Yeah, let's just go ahead and set up the intro for you guys. I kind of just want to jump into the video sometimes, but then you start complaining, you didn't play the intro. Come on, guys, is it that important to you? There, you got your fucking intro. Alrighty, let's jump into TFM's video and check it out and see what the fuck he has to say. There we go.
This is Turd Flinging Monkey for TFM News. I'm going to be responding to an article that appeared in New Scientist, January 30th, 2017, called Chimps Beat Up, Murder, and Then Cannibalize Their Former Tyrant. So you may be wondering what this article about chimpanzees has to do with the title of the video, but I assure you they're connected. Let's just start with the article. Quote, "It was a gruesome scene. The body had severe wounds and was still bleeding despite having been laying for a few hours in the hot Senegalese savanna. The murder victim, a West African chimpanzee called Fudoku, had been beaten with rocks and sticks, stomped on, and then cannibalized by his own community."
Now, this is an interesting point. A lot of people say we're human beings, however, and human beings and chimps are not the same. However, I want you guys to notice something. Whenever a human being literally goes insane, when people have a psychotic breakdown, notice that their behavior resembles very much that of a chimp. The grunting, the jumping around. If you've ever noticed what psychosis looks like, you'll notice that it looks very similar. Extreme psychosis looks very similar to the behavior found in a chimpanzee when it's completely lost in rage. We are very, very similar to chimps. I think something like 90% of our DNA is actually similar or the same as a chimp. So think about that factor very carefully and then understand the reasons why we are so comparable to chimps and why we look at the hierarchy and behaviors of chimps to see how our own societies may eventually develop.
This is just one of 9 known cases where a group of chimpanzees killed one of their own adult males, as opposed to killing a member of a neighboring tribe. These intragroup killings are rare, but Michael Wilson of the University of Minnesota says they are a valuable insight into chimp behavior, such as male coalition building. So the first thing to understand in this article is that chimpanzees killing one of their own is rare. So what would cause this community of chimpanzees to kill one of their own? And later on in the article it explains. It says, quote, "Chimps usually live in groups with more adult females than males. But in the group with the murder, it was the other way around. Quote, when you reverse that and have almost 2 males per every female, that usually intensifies the competition for reproduction. That seems to be a very key factor here," unquote, says Wilson. It then goes on to explain how this whole thing happened. Basically, the chimpanzee that was killed was the former alpha. However, he was injured and he was exiled from the troop. He tried to come back because the chimpanzees were too isolated, he couldn't find anywhere to go. And his former beta, who had become the alpha, made him the new beta. And the other young chimpanzees thought that was bullshit, and then they killed him. It then says that the alpha was overthrown. The one that took the former alpha and made him his beta, he was overthrown, kicked out of the group by the same group of chimpanzees that killed the guy. So there's been a coup. There's been a chimp coup. And that's really the end of the article. Now, why am I bringing this up? Why am I talking about this? In my video, The Magic of Male...
Honestly, I thought Turd was talking about it simply because, it may have been some of his relatives and, it bothered him. But, I can understand how this would also relate to gynocentrism. Yeah?
Of male scarcity. I talked about how the key for having a non-gynocentric society was having more women than men. Now, under normal circumstances, simply due to the law of averages, you're going to have about an equal number of females and males. Now, in this group of chimpanzees, they had twice as many males than females. So they tried to exile males, but because the males had nowhere to go, because this community was isolated and being observed by these scientists, and then the same problem persists. There's too many men, there's not enough women to go around, so they end up killing each other in order to thin their numbers. So let's talk about what causes gynocentrism. I said in a previous video, gynocentrism is the connection of two things: female choice and male competition. In bygone ages, there was usually a shortage of men due to war. There were fewer men to compete with, and thus there wasn't gynocentrism. The men who survived the war had their pick of the women. Not just their own women, but usually the women of the conquered tribe as well. There were plenty of women to go around, and a lot of the men were dead, so there you go. Exploration became another avenue where men could take themselves out of the society, thus limiting competition among males, and thus keeping gynocentrism from taking root. However, the world has been thoroughly explored, except for maybe the darkest depths of the ocean. Every inch of the earth has been mapped and claimed. There's no more frontier for men to go to explore and to strike out on their own. Just like with the chimpanzee group.
Now, this is one thing I will touch upon. He says that there's no more frontier for men to strike out onto and to go out onto their own. That is true, but then there's also it's not completely true. While the land around us has been taken and economized and built upon by many, there are still many opportunities to strike out on our own. Even in the United States, there's tons and tons of land that is undeveloped. You heard me right. We're not, here you're talking about lands that were undiscovered or that were very isolated. Even though there's still not lots of land that is undiscovered, there's still lots and lots of space that is undeveloped. The vast majority of the earth is undeveloped today. People live in very small centralized areas. They tend to migrate towards cities. To be very honest, the actual planet itself can support easily something along the lines of 100 billion people versus the 6 to 7 billion people that we have on the planet today. If you actually wanted to become very specific, you could probably fit the entire population of the United States within the limits of Los Angeles. Again, we're talking about personalized space and everyone having a certain amount of space for themselves, because people are spread out. But realistically speaking, most people do live in cities. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to actually strike out on their own, to actually do something different. Part of the problem is regulation and overregulation that makes it difficult for people to try new things, especially in the United States. Although guys like Donald Trump are now trying to lift those regulations to incentivize the growth of business and creating new ventures. So there is, despite the fact that the undiscovered frontier is no longer there, there is still a frontier and there is still an opportunity to create. I believe that a lot of men have simply become lazy, or shouldn't say lazy, but they've become used to receiving and living in a stable society where the concept is you go to college, get an education, and then you get a job, rather than you actually strike out for yourself and start a business, or you try something that no one has done before. Again, there's so many places, there's so much land that is undeveloped, but a lot of people are now have chosen to literally live in developed places and fend off those resources rather than striking out and building out a new platform, building out new cities, building out new towns. That's something that we're seeing less and less of.
Group. When the men were kicked out, they had nowhere to go. Now, a lot of people will argue that the fundamental disposability of men and the value of women is gynocentric, but that's not what the definition means. Gynocentrism is when you place the woman and her point of view at the center. The reason why men compete for females is because they're a resource. Now, you could replace women with any other resource. If there were too many men and there wasn't enough food or there wasn't enough water, or whatever, any sort of resource that they needed. You could use the proverbial lifeboat scenario, where there's too many people in the lifeboat and it's going to sink. And so you have to kill somebody on the lifeboat. Otherwise, you're all going to die. Women are a resource just like food, water, whatever. And
Now, here's the thing. He says women are a resource just like food, water, whatever. However, men are a resource. You see, without men, women can't survive. And it was much more like that and common, well seen in society before we had the developed world, before we had societies where women had the resources of men redistributed to them. Look, if you look at the government has been redistributing the resources of men to women for over a century now. At least, well, or should I say, for decades. Since the 1950s, 1960s, when feminism came around, second wave feminism. That's right around the time where the government came out with welfare and began instituting more and more social welfare programs that began giving the resources of men to women through taxation. However, many of those programs are now coming to an end. And one of the reasons why they're coming to an end is because the government doesn't have the money to keep supporting them anymore. Money doesn't grow on trees. Typically, money comes from men. Men pay 85% of all the taxes in the world, and women make 85% of all the consumer purchases. This talks and highlights the difference between behaviors. Men create, women cannibalize. That's how women operate. Now, men are a resource in the sense that we've always provided resources for women. So we provide protection, we provide security, and these are very big factors. We provide our survival value. Women, on the other hand, their resource has been the ability to provide children. So don't act like women are a resource that men simply have to vie for. Women also vie for men because men are vital to the survival of women. It's only in modern day society where the government has been reallocating the resources of men to women why that fundamental principle has been thrown out of balance. But men are as just as much a resource as women are a resource, and I argue that men are more of a vital resource than women, because think about this very carefully. Without men who have the cognitive and physical capacity to create environments that can sustain life, women having children doesn't make any sense. First off, you need a man to have a child for a woman to have a baby. Then beyond that, even though you can argue very quickly that one man can father many children with multiple different women, while many men can't father multiple children with one woman at the same time. While I understand that argument, do not forget that again, it takes men to protect a woman, to gather resources, to offer that survival value. Without that survival value, a woman would not be able to survive. And even in modern day society, if as men turn away from women and their resources are not reallocated to providing for women, women will find it increasingly difficult to survive, even in modern day society.
and men will compete for that resource. Now again, if there's war, and there's natural male scarcity, there's not going to be gynocentrism. If there's a frontier, if there's places where men who are forced out or simply want to leave to go to, there's no gynocentrism. Now this article reminded me of a third element to gynocentrism. Because what these chimps did is they didn't become gynocentric. They just started killing each other. So in the absence of war, in the absence of a frontier, men will kill each other to thin out their numbers, to bring about that natural male scarcity. Now humans differ in this, because they've created laws and civilizations. Now I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but there are consequences. And the consequence is, when you don't have male scarcity, and you don't have a frontier, and you have explicit laws which keep men from competing physically for women, in the absence of physical competition between men, where men can literally eliminate their rivals, what can men do other than turn to gynocentrism in order to compete that way? Gynocentrism is a mating strategy that men use to compete for women. If you can't eliminate your competition physically, you have to appeal to women. And this is where the female choice comes in. Now in patriarchal animals like chimpanzees, the females have no choice. When the alpha is overthrown by a new alpha, the females just submit to the new alpha. But in humans, females have been given choice over who they partner with, who they reproduce with. And this creates the intersection that I've talked about, where
Okay, now you say women have been given choice. That's actually a recent occurrence. I mean, if you go back 100, 200, if you go back 100 years ago, it was typical for the man a father to essentially select or approve of the husband that would end up with his daughter. And this is how something that's been normal in most patriarchal societies throughout history. Typically, it was either the father who found a husband for his daughters, or had to at the very least approve of the suitor that wanted his daughter. This is something that was very, very common. It changed over some time. At some time in history, women suddenly began making the choice for themselves. But typically, that was not how society worked. Men were the ones who always chose who their daughters, who females had relationships with.
where male competition meets female choice, and that intersection is where gynocentrism comes from. Now, the purpose of this video isn't just to repeat what I've already said in past videos. It's to demonstrate a point. If we want to live in a society that isn't gynocentric, and I assume we all do, it's one of the big things about MGTOW is anti-gynocentrism. In order to live in that world, you have to accept that the only alternative is male scarcity. Men are going to have to either die in war, go explore some frontier, or kill each other.
And this is the point that I want to make. Turd is saying that, we're going to have to, there needs to be male scarcity to, to reduce gynocentrism. Not correct. What we really need is a scarcity of resources. A scarcity of resources is what reduces gynocentrism, especially in a society like we have today. We already have a society where there are more females than males. So why is it in a society where there are more females than males, women are still able to act in a gynocentric nature? Quite simple. It's because women are being given ample amounts of resources that they are not earning. They are having our resources as men reallocated to them. However, again, as feminism dies off and women lose the ability to extract resources from men, as fewer men are getting married and the government is pulling back on the amount of resources, entitlements that women receive, which are paid for by men, that creates a lack of resources. A lack of resources in women means that more and more women are going to fall back onto traditional gender roles where they will want a man to provide for them. As they can find fewer men who are willing to provide for them or have the capacity to provide for them, that there creates scarcity in and of itself. So you don't actually need a war to prevent men to actually lead to scarcity. It's actually a scarcity of resources that will result in a reduction in gynocentrism. Think about that very carefully.
That is the only way to create a world without gynocentrism. So just think about that. We look around, we see all the problems that gynocentrism is causing in society. We see the problems it creates, we see how it makes men's lives objectively worse. And we want to fix it. That's what men do, they want to fix problems. But appreciate the fact that something has to fill in that vacuum. Once gynocentrism is taken out, something has to replace it. And it's not going to be egalitarianism. Let's realistically look at the alternatives. The only alternative to a gynocentric society is a patriarchal society. And in order to keep that patriarchal society from becoming gynocentric, what we colloquially call traditionalism, you have to have physical competition. You have to have
To prevent a patriarchal society from becoming gynocentric, you don't simply have to create surplus male scarcity. You just have to create scarcity of resources. Scarcity of resources and the availability to females leads to a demand for more males. Not only will they demand more males, but they will want men of value. But again, a lack of resources also means that they'll have to begin to compromise. In society today, a woman can get a home, she can have a place to live, food to eat, even have things provided for her children without having a man at all. In fact, these are typically the terms in which a woman can gain access to those resources by simply not having a man in the home. However, as these factors completely vanish, as women lose the ability to gain access to Section 8 government subsidized housing, as they lose access to food stamps, as they lose access to programs like WIC that provide endless amounts of support just to keep having children, as they lose access to abortion care, abortion funds, abortion services, as they lose access to free birth control. Again, it's going to be more difficult for them to ride the cock carousel without getting pregnant. It's going to be more difficult for them to get rid of the child when they get in trouble, because they were irresponsible and they couldn't get birth control. It's going to be more difficult for them to feed their children or even keep their children because they won't have programs such as subsidized housing, food stamps, and all these different entitlements to keep them afloat. So they won't be able to take care of their children or themselves. Again, they're going to begin to compromise more and more where, in a society like this, women basically don't need a man for survival because they can survive. They can have food, a home, and protection for their families without a man actually being there. However, in the new economy, in the new society, women will no longer be able to do that, meaning that resources will become more difficult to acquire for a woman, significantly more difficult. They will no longer be getting those handouts. Remove the handouts, and suddenly, in a society where you have more women than men, which is what we have today, women are going to begin making compromises. However, the number of men that are actually capable of supporting a family, and are willing to support a family, those numbers have dropped significantly in the recent decades. There are fewer men willing to get married. There are fewer men willing to have children. There are fewer men that are actually considering a future together with a long-term partner. And then and even from the men that are actually want those things still, you have to factor in how many actually have the capacity to do that. As fewer men are going to college, starting businesses, actually doing anything in life, and more young men are just staying at home. They might be gathering their resources together, but they're saving small amounts of resources. They're just enough to take care of themselves, not a future partner. So the number of men that will actually be suitable mates for women in this generation, I shouldn't say coming generation, in this generation, because we're getting old. Us millennials are starting to get old. And, the number of suitable men, and I mean, when I say suitable, I mean men who are able to provide. They can provide a place to live for a woman. They can provide food, and maybe they want to have children. Again, just men who are able to provide. Those type of men are becoming fewer and fewer. That's something that you have to understand. You have to consider those factors. So it's not a need for male scarcity right now. It's a simple factor that it's a lack of resources. In places like China, that's where you can say that there is a need for male scarcity because there's significantly more men than women, and as a result of that, there are not enough women to go around, and a lot of men will never get married or have children, and that is a very patriarchal society. That's an interesting factor that you would say in China. But in a place like the US and in most Western countries, there is no surplus of men. There's actually a surplus of women. In the UK, for example, more baby boys are born, but more baby girls will make it to adulthood. And as a result of that, there's a surplus of baby girls there's a surplus of women in society when come adulthood than males. Again, what we're looking at is a reduction in resources will result in a scarcity for women of resources, and a scarcity of resources will result in a greater demand for males among women.
You have to have war. You have to have men killing each other, or you have to have a frontier that men can explore and remove themselves from the system. You have to maintain male scarcity. Now, this assumes a naturalistic.
You must maintain scarcity of resources, not scarcity of men. For a country to have, for a country to be strong, you need lots of men. You know, I talked about Turd in a previous collab. In the last Angry Monkey podcast, we discussed this, and you know, he brought up a point that, you know, a lot of the beta males that are here today and having children in society, they would not be allowed to have children. They would be kept as eunuchs and slaves.
Holistic solution. If you throw in transhumanism, sex robots, artificial wombs, space exploration, you know, who knows? Any one of those technologies could be a game changer. But assuming those technologies either don't work out as expected or are centuries off, if you look at the naturalistic solutions, if you look at the way societies behave when they aren't gynocentric, that is what characterizes a non-gynocentric patriarchy. So just consider the costs. I'm still anti-gynocentrism. I'm fine with war. There is no perfect utopian solution. There is no solution where everyone wins. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers. Sometimes when you do solve the problem, you create another problem. Now, whether or not that problem is worse than the original problem is something you need to ask yourself. Is the problem worth solving? Ask yourself which would be the least shitty situation for men. And ultimately, and I'm not the first person to make this observation, if you're MGTOW living in a gynocentric society, you can shield yourself from the most negative aspects of that society, and you could live a pretty good life. I mean, look at us, we're talking on YouTube, we're playing video games, we're having a good time. In a patriarchal society where there were wars all the time, I certainly wouldn't have the time to play video games and make YouTube videos. And this is why, contrary to what some people believe, I don't want the collapse to happen yet. I really want to give these technologies time, because hopefully these technologies can help us get out of this cycle. We can use things like transhumanism, artificial womb, sex robots, to create a world where we don't have to murder each other, to create a world where our options don't simply consist of a gynocentric feminist society.
Now, this is something I do agree with, that in the future there will be an increasing number of men who will actually stop having relationships entirely with women and essentially focus on having relationships with technology. And again, even if 10% of the male population were to do this and exhibit this behavior, that's a major drop off. Because when you consider that a number of men will never reproduce to begin with, that's another huge factor. Something that Turd Flinging Monkey doesn't consider is that throughout the vast history of mankind, despite the fact that there was always more men, you know, or there was always this balance between men and women, there's a large majority of men that would never reproduce to begin with. It's never been a case where all men would get a chance to reproduce, or the majority of men would get to reproduce. A large number of men, maybe almost the vast majority, the majority of men may have never gotten a chance to reproduce. It's only in modern day society where we have structural societies where even beta males get a chance to reproduce. But historically, such a thing would not have happened. So it was only the stronger men who got an opportunity to reproduce. It's not an issue of male scarcity. There's no imbalance today where there's too many men. If that was the case, then society and the world would have collapsed long ago, and gynocentrism would have been a major issue in the past as well. That's not true at all. The fact of the matter is just that women have gained easier access to a man's resources, where they don't actually have to be in a relationship with him to gain access to those resources, because the government has facilitated a method where women can strip a man of his resources or gain access to his resources through reallocation of those resources in the using entitlements. But as those entitlements are now vanishing, those resources will vanish, and women will want men again in the way they have in the past, so they can gain access to those resources again. However, like I said, male scarcity is not simply men dying off, but it's also men choosing not to have relationships at all. Even without artificial wombs, even without sex robots and all of those things, I honestly see behavioral changes among men, specifically the millennials, as pushing towards a society where women will demand more men, They want more. They will want men, but men won't actually want them. There won't be enough men that will have the resources to take care of a woman and that actually wants to be in a relationship with a woman, a long-term relationship to form a family unit with her. Then don't forget that a number of women in our generation, the millennials preferably, are also getting older. They're getting older. I'm looking at some of the comments. Some of you guys are idiots in the comments. There's a lot of women who have gotten older in the millennial generation. They've already hit the wall, and their chances of reproducing are slimming down, really going down. So that's something we also have to consider as well. Ryan Brewer says angry MGTOW is a weakling, and I think I'd beat him up and enslave him in a more primitive time. To be honest, I'm not a weakling, and in a more primitive time, I'd simply killed. I'd probably just killed anyone I needed to and move on. You know, it's actually the strong who are being damaged in a society like the ones we have today, where the effeminate people are able to use gynocentrism to silence those who would traditionally stand up. I mean, here's this guy is talking shit, but here you are on YouTube talking shit. I actually have a channel where I'm actually talking about the issues in society. I'm actually brave enough, and I'm not using a voice synthesizer to hide what my voice sounds like either. So when you see some little shit talking crap in a chat section, you have to ask, what are you doing? You're on the internet, you're hiding, you're in someone else's chat, you're anonymous as fuck, and now you're saying that you'd be an alpha. No, you wouldn't be an alpha. You'd be a bitch that would be plotting. What, you're gonna hit me with a big stone when I'm not looking? You better hope that you pull it off when I'm not looking, because chances are, even if you got me, the men around me would probably take you out. You gotta be kidding me. Ryan Brewer says, angry MGTOW is Omega, I'm Alpha. You might be kind of brain dead, actually. Anyway, guys, I want to know if you agree with what I'm saying, and if you agree that, in a gynocentric society, the key to getting rid of gynocentrism is not actually getting rid of men, but it's getting rid of the privileges and entitlements that women have access to.
And men murdering each other in order to maintain male scarcity. So don't be too eager for society to collapse. I hope it doesn't. In the meantime, men still need to go MGTOW. They still need to protect themselves. And if the collapse comes, be prepared. Take the time you have now to prepare for that collapse so that it doesn't bite you in the ass. This is Turd Flinging Monkey signing off.
Okay, so Turd is a great sidekick. He's a great sidekick, and sometimes he nails it, sometimes he misses it. I think in this video he was somewhere in between. He made a lot of good points, such as understanding male scarcity and how the lack of male scarcity can result in gynocentrism, but he doesn't seem to factor that it's not scarcity of males, it's a surplus of resources and the availability of resources to females that creates this issue. If we look at the fall of Rome, during the fall of Rome, what actually led to the fall was a surplus of resources. So for example, you ended up having women in ancient Rome, things had gotten to the point where the average Roman citizen could actually live without working. So the average Roman citizen did not have to work to survive. They received enough money from the empire that they could go to universities, they could study law, they could do whatever they wanted to do without actually having to work. You heard me. That was how much of a surplus the Roman Empire had. Then they passed no-fault divorces, where women could divorce their husbands using no fault. And this was a point where society began to degrade. Keep in mind that women, the average Roman citizen, women being citizens, did not have to work either. So they can get a divorce from their husbands, and after they got a divorce from their husbands, they could go off and ride the cock carousel as much as they wanted. Don't forget that. And don't forget, with no-fault divorces, they could also get a portion of their husband's assets. This is how no-fault divorce works. So When you consider these factors, because of the surplus of resources, that's what led to the fall of Rome and allowed women to ride the cock carousel, easily utilize no fault divorce, and get away with it. But as men decided that they no longer wanted to have relationships with women because things were going to hell and the women were riding gladiator cocks, nothing lasts forever. Resources began to run out. As a result of fewer men actually, going out, generating resources, as more and more men pulled back from society, society began to collapse. Those resources began to run out and scarcity began to happen. It got so bad that Augustus Caesar called unmarried men worse than murderers, robbers, and all of the rapists. You heard me right. Augustus Caesar said that, attempting to shame these men, unmarried men. It got so bad that unmarried men were actually punished and they were not allowed to attend banquets, public events, and during the wintertime, they were even made to run alongside each other in the streets as a punishment to shame them, and still these men would not marry. Yeah, they were the classic MGTOW. And then after a few centuries, Rome collapsed because there was also the very thing where men stopped going into the military, men stopped protecting the country, men basically fell out of society, and after that happened, the government began using mercenaries to protect the country, and then the mercenaries realized that the government didn't have any money to pay them, which is why they were offering up land. So they basically took the emperor's bluff. They pushed the emperor's bluff and pillaged the kingdom, and after that happened, Rome fell. We fell into the Dark Ages. We had around 1,200 years of the loss of science, math, medicine, and people eating squirrel meat and living in caves. And it wasn't until monks and monasteries rediscovered science that we came out of the Dark Ages, over 1,000 years later. This is how the fall of everything. This is how the fall of Rome happened. It was because of resources, not because of male scarcity or the surplus of men. It was because of the surplus of resources and the availability of those resources to women without the need for a man to be involved in their lives. This is the same thing that's happening, but we're seeing a reversal of this right now in the world. We're seeing a reversal as those resources are beginning to dry up and they're no longer readily available to women through entitlements. I honestly don't want the world to end, but if it does, I wouldn't honestly think that women didn't bring it onto themselves because of their greed and their demand for taking resources that are unearned. But let me know what you think, if you agree that women will attack each other after feminism dies, and that feminism is dying this year. And also, I do want to remind you guys that you can help me to continue making quality content. Please consider doing that by heading over to my Patreon. I make a bunch of videos every day, about 3 videos every single day for you guys, plus bonus videos. And you can find my Patreon by going to my YouTube homepage, and you can see that there's a Patreon link at the top of my YouTube homepage. You can just click on the Patreon link to go over to my Patreon and become a regular contributor to my work. And there's a bunch of rewards. This will ensure that I can continue to make quality content for you guys. Also, never miss another Angry MGTOW video by clicking on the notification button next to the subscribe button below any of my videos. You'll get a pop-up that says send me all notifications for this channel. Just click on the little box, hit save. If you've already done it, you don't have to do it again, and this will ensure that you always receive a notification whenever I'm streaming or whenever I put out a new video. Let me know if you agree that women will attack each other after feminism dies, and that it's not the scarcity of men that determines whether or not women want a man, and it's actually the scarcity of resources. And in a society where women are getting resources of men through entitlements, when those entitlements run out, as those entitlements are removed from females, they will again see the need for men. And in many ways, in a society like ours, where there's already more females than men, there will be a form of scarcity. Let me know if you agree in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, definitely go ahead and hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MGTOW or death. And cheers.